Welcome to another episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. And for those of you who are watching along on YouTube, the person that you're seeing at the bottom of your screen is Laurie Gilbertson. Laurie is a mother of three who spent 10 years in the district attorney's office in New York City. She's been seen in the media as a legal analyst, and she is the owner of Tribeca Blue Consulting, where she helps executives, trial attorneys, and other entrepreneurs communicate with more confidence, clarity, and creativity. She is also an advisor for the Legal Entrepreneurs for Justice program. As a lawyer, entrepreneur, coach, advisor, and parent, there's gonna be a lot to talk about today. So thank you for being here with us.
Arjun and Jay, thanks so much for having me.
And it's nice to actually have a fellow New Yorker on. We could see the art in your background, and just reading your background, it's great to have a New Yorker on.
Oh, yeah. I saw that you've got a lot of New York and New Jersey in your background. So always love to talk to a fellow East Coaster.
Nice. Yeah, it's running through the veins. Yeah. So as I was alluding to earlier, you have experience in the Queens County DA's office. You were there, in the mid 90s and early 2000s. You were prosecuting homicides and organized crime and sexual assaults and even violent felonies. So as someone who knows about true crime, what can you tell us about some of the more gripping cases that stand out in your mind? The ones where you couldn't believe what you were discovering, you couldn't believe that you had a responsibility to prosecute, or maybe you were part of a trial that simply had a really surprising outcome. I think, as a human, when you look at where attention is drawn and what people are focused on, it's this type of stuff. People love courtroom drama. They love true crime drama. And so I think people are fascinated by this. So when it comes to that, what can you tell us about some of the more gripping cases that stand out in your mind?
Wow. Yeah, you are so right. I mean, true crime is out there. There are so many podcasts, right? Law and Order is in its gazillionth season with like an infinity number of spinoffs. People are fascinated by it. I think for the same reason I wanted to go into it is that you cannot beat the stories. Just the incredible human stories. They are full of emotion. They are full of huge themes. And ultimately, it's true crime. I mean, these aren't things that are being made up on television. These are things that, in a very scary way, people actually do to other people.
Yeah.
And that's what we can't forget when even talking about this, that, there are real victims. And there are real defendants who have families also, so there's a ripple effect of people who are affected by true crime. That being said, you asked about something gripping or something that didn't quite turn out the way I thought.
Yeah.
Gosh, let me see what I can choose from there. My very last case that I tried, I was trying violent felonies, so attempted murders, homicides, as well as robberies, burglaries, and those kinds of things. And there was a school shooting on the campus of St. John's University in New York. This was back in 2001. And although so much of that has proliferated these days, and unfortunately, we see so much violence and school shootings in the news, there were fewer back in 2001. So this was big news in New York. And what happened was the defendant in this case took out a handgun on the campus of St. John's University and started spewing fire into a crowd of about 15 to 20 people. And one person who was a very promising football player, as he was running away, got hit by a bullet in his back and was permanently paralyzed from the waist down. And so 2 other people got hit, not injured quite as badly. But this was this very promising person kind of at the cusp of his life and his career. He maybe even had a future going into the NFL, and just probably one of the nicest people you will ever meet, kind of this big bear of a giant guy who was just so kind.
Yeah.
And I caught that case. The way that we tried cases back in the DA's office then was that one person would get the case in the beginning, And then you'd handle it all the way through so that victims didn't have to tell their stories all the time, so that it wasn't, and have that kind of trauma. And so that you would know all the facts going through, so that things would really stick with you and you'd kind of be the foundational person. So I tried this case. The shooter was caught the next day. There were 7 eyewitnesses. One of the shooter's friends even turned on him and identified him.
Wow.
Right? You would think open and shut, right? Totally open and shut. Maybe go to a plea because it's pretty open and shut. Well, the defendant refused to take a plea in this case, and we went to trial. So once again, you'd think open and shut. I mean, you're going to put 7 witnesses on and everyone's going to identify the guy. And this is so gripping and so emotional. Things didn't quite turn out that way.
Wow.
There was a lot of evidence led into the case that, I believe shouldn't have been let in. Experts came in on eyewitness testimony to talk about how these 7 people were totally wrong. And while there are things about eyewitness testimony that can come in, this was the very first expert allowed. And there was no hearing, there was no foundation, there was nothing to really prepare for. It was just, the guy's going to be let in, counselor, you're crossing him tomorrow. So I did a crash course overnight.
Yeah.
And, ultimately it was, it all worked out okay, but you would think open and shut, and just things kept coming and flying at us. And we had, one person in the jury that hung the jury and refused to convict. And so I tried the case again. And ultimately it led to a conviction. But the second time I tried the case, you asked what was kind of gripping and not expected. Well, the second time I tried the case, the defendant was not taking any chances on getting that one person. So he actually convinced one of his friends to lie for him. The guy got on the stand, lied for him, and we were able to prove it through some phone records. And then I ultimately arrested his friend, charged his friend with perjury, charged the defendant with perjury. And that was the first perjury case where a defendant who did not take the stand was charged with perjury.
Wow.
And we had to try the case again because of everything that happened and get them all lawyers and go through indictments. The third time was the charm. Once there was no more perjury, hopefully, in that case, although I believe there was some from the defendant's family, but we did not charge them with anything. All the evidence got in front of the jury, and it took about 2 hours. They came back with a conviction on everything. So
phenomenal.
You think it should go a certain way, and on Law and Order, maybe it would, but in real life, you just never know. And ultimately, I was also threatened and had to have a police escort. Everywhere that I went, because they really thought, well, if this guy is going to pay people to perjure themselves, we thought he might have been tampering with the jury to get a hung jury. He had said certain things that led, I guess, the detectives involved in the case to think he might be a threat to me. Then they were going to give me protection. So it was quite a whirlwind, and that was my last case before I left the office. I did not leave because of that case. I, in fact, stayed for an extra 2 years to kind of do what the victim wanted, which was he wanted me to try it. So I stayed and I did it. So
that is a gripping. Yeah, that is a gripping tale.
That's a great answer. Yeah.
I mean, it talk about just the threads there of just like, it kind of just talks, you can learn about that. Like how it just reflects life, right? Like you just don't know what the outcome is going to be, or you expect it to go a certain way and it's just going to go that way, and things get complicated and you just have to weather the storm and get through it and get to the outcome. I think it's fascinating. And to your point earlier, it's like, it's really interesting to think about what humans are capable and then what the ripple effect is of their behavior. So I truly find that fascinating. I think there's so much psychology involved, and I'd be curious to know, like, how can you tell us how you get into the mind of a jury? I mean, again, talking about psychology and the layers that are involved there. I mean, you're trying to push individuals to think a certain way based on how you're presenting the evidence. And then you're collectively trying to get the jury to feel the same way. So it's like an individual level and a collective level. So I'd be curious if you've figured out certain tactics that allow you to get into the mind of people a little bit better so that they can actually see things from the perspective that you want them to see it from?
Yeah, juries are a really interesting animal. And the person that figures them out for good and has every tactic to make them go their way is going to make a lot of money writing a lot of books and teaching a lot of seminars. There are a lot of things you can do. I had a mentor who told me once, I'll take the first 12 in the box. Just put him in there, I'll convince him, because he was that confident of how convincing he was. I think that was a bit of bravado. And there's a lot more involved than that, although he was an incredible trial lawyer. So the first thing with juries is you got to think of juries as people who you want to appeal to their common sense. You do not want them to leave their common sense at the courtroom door. You want them to bring their experiences and the same kind of reasoning that they would use, with their family or at work or with a friend to the jury box. It can be an incredibly intimidating place to be. I don't know if either of you have had jury duty or ever had to testify in a case. Have you ever had that either way?
I did. Yeah, I actually got mugged when I was traveling in London.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty harrowing few minutes. Fortunately, a cop came by right after, and we got in the van and were able to track the assailants down, and they were all arrested. And then 2 years later, I remotely testified from California in the case, and they all ended up getting convicted. But yeah, it was I don't want to say amazing because maybe that's too positive of a word, but it's a pretty amazing process just being part of the legal system and contributing in that way.
No, good for you for having the commitment to see that through.
Yeah, thank you.
Towards justice. It is not easy to testify, especially when you have the trauma of being the victim of a crime. It's scary.
Totally. Yeah. When you're in that situation, you don't know what the person's going to do. I mean, they were kind of gesturing at me with the handle of a knife in their waistband. So
oh my gosh.
I was, in retrospect, you think, oh, maybe that, they never intended, to do any violence unto me. But in the situation, you just don't know. It comes out of nowhere. I mean, you truly think that this could be the end. So yeah, it's an incredibly intense experience. Yeah.
It is. And then, it is also an incredibly intense experience to have to relive that, even by video in a courtroom. And you are putting these, 6 people, sometimes for misdemeanors, or 12 people into the position of judging whether you're telling the truth, whether your story makes sense to them, and then asking them for the courage and the bravery to convict someone.
Right.
And even though juries, do not deal with punishment in most cases, and certainly in New York, they did not, that's the province of the judge, you are asking people to make what can be a really difficult decision on something that in criminal cases is generally going to be very traumatic for all the people who they witness, such as yourself, who comes in and tells this incredibly gripping story. So you want these jurors to use their common sense. You want them to look at someone like you, Jay, and just listen to what you went through. And does it make sense? And were you in a position to see the person who held a knife to you? And are you a credible witness? And use their common sense for all of those things. So you don't want them to leave that out. So that's the first thing you want to look for in a jury. And that's kind of a tactic, but how do you learn that? How do you get that? In court in New York, depending on the case, you have very little time to talk to people. You would generally get a questionnaire that kind of tells you where people live, whether they own or rent their home, which was, to me, always a strange question, as if they were going to be kind of more attached to the community if they own their home as opposed to rented it. I don't know if they still ask that question these days. I don't know if that matters all, but it always struck me as a little strange. But anyways, whether they've been the victim of a crime, whether they've been accused or convicted of a crime, and what they do for a living. That's kind of what you know. And so you're getting these just people, and the problem is that you look at that and you kind of think, oh, they're from this area. These are generally people who work in these professions. And there's a stereotype that people in these professions have a lot of common sense. So I want someone there. Or, you really kind of have to start narrowing things down. but you usually get, depending on the seriousness of the case, a very short time, anywhere from, 5 minutes to 20 minutes to talk to a group of, 60 people. So you start by asking questions. You start by kind of narrowing things down, asking people specifically about the case in which you're trying, and also knowing what kind of a juror are you looking for. That's something that trial lawyers really need to go in to their cases, knowing if I had, say, a witness in a case who had a criminal record, as I did many, many times, or say the victim in a case, as I had one time, who had a lengthy criminal record. I had to somehow talk to people on the jury to get people onto that jury who were going to look at him in a fair way and judge that story, and not hold the criminal record, which was going to come out, which they were going to be cross-examined about, ad nauseum against them. So that may be a different thing that I'm looking at than, say, in a domestic violence case or a sexual assault case. So I think tactics with juries really knowing your case and the kind of jurors you're looking for, and knowing the psychology a bit of it. Okay, so you want to give your jury, to be people who kind of feel that they can take on this big decision. Right? They can take it on, and they can ultimately come to, at least for a prosecutor, come to a conviction and be okay. As I often ask jurors, would you be okay coming back into this courtroom, looking right at this defendant, and if you believe that I have proven my case, saying guilty?
Wow.
Can you live with that? Can you do that? Can you do justice in that way? Is that something that, even if you may not be comfortable, you can get yourself to and take the oath? Because jurors take an oath to do that. Can you do that? So it's a big deal. And a lot of it too, at least for me, relied on intuition. And that's, it's great to talk about all different tactics, but I think every trial lawyer has their favorite kinds of jurors. They're the people who they connect with. And the people that I connected with may be different from people that other trial lawyers connected with. I happen to love nurses. I loved nurses. They were compassionate. They were kind. They were quick thinking, and they had no problem with fighting authority. They definitely didn't capitulate to authority, and they had no problem sharing their knowledge and trying to convince other people of things if they believed that they were right. Because I think that is what nurses often do. And we see that now, during COVID and this huge role they've taken in the pandemic. They do that in their work. So I love them bringing their skills and doing that. I have to say that in 10 years of prosecuting, every single nurse I put on a jury was like an amazing human being.
Oh, wow.
And I don't want to stereotype necessarily, but that was my intuition and connection. And sometimes you just connect and you feel it. Sometimes there are jurors that would answer all the questions correctly. They would feel confident in returning a verdict. They kind of had the whole pedigree maybe you were looking for, but they're just, I didn't necessarily feel they were being open. And then you try to just kind of get underneath that, and you try to kind of get them to talk more and share more. But jury selection, I think, is one of the most difficult things to do. And it is absolutely the most important, because they're going to be the decision makers. In federal court, trial lawyers don't even get to talk to the jury during jury selection. They submit questions that the judge then asks. So, as much as you want to use certain tactics, and there are trial consultants like out the wazoo who will come in with every psychological tactic, I found it just came down to the decision of, did I believe this person would be fair and have an open mind and use their common sense? And if they could do that, then I wanted them.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting too about speaking in the courtroom, a lot of people get hung up on nerves. I feel like one of the big kind of detractors from people's performance with respect to public speaking is nerves. They very often get the best of people. And in the courtroom, the stakes are so high. Not only is your track record on the line, but in a much bigger way, you're responsible for getting justice for the victims. In some situations, you're responsible for getting a violent criminal off the street. How did you think about calming your nerves and making sure they didn't interfere with your performance as a communicator in the courtroom? Because it's such a unique situation to be in.
Yeah. It really came down to practice, preparation, and knowing my case.
Mm-hmm.
When I started, I was told you have to do at least 10 trials until you're comfortable. It's going to take at least 10. And that was very sage advice. And it was. What I found ultimately with nerves was if I wanted to go into that courtroom knowing the case better than anyone else, knowing what my witnesses were hopefully going to say on the stand, right? being prepared for when they didn't, or if they didn't show up, knowing my legal arguments, trying to get into the head, not just of the jury, but of defense counsel and the defendant and what were they going to come at it with. And if I knew that, if I was the most prepared person, if I knew the defendant's life better than he did, if I knew my witness's background better than they did, if I even knew about probably my jury more than they did, and every single one, that aided in my nerves because I knew I had done everything I could. What I found as I got more comfortable and as I got more experience in the courtroom was that I had a lot of nerves until I said my first words. And my first words were usually during jury selection, when I would be able to get up and talk to the jury. So if I knew exactly what I was going to say in those first 30 seconds, and it was just in my head, like on autopilot, I could take a few deep breaths, I could get up, say those 30 seconds. And then for me, it just went away. But those nerves, that came with practice. Just, as you said, being in court is a really intimidating place. You talk about track record, and I think while some people care about that, the stakes are too important to care about that. People will ask me, what's your record? And say, I don't know. I can tell you the cases I won. I can tell you about the cases I lost. And any trial lawyer who has only won his cases or her cases is not trying hard cases, I believe. Or is just taking cases they can win. You're going to lose. Things are going to happen. I found just a way of what the world is in dealing with humans. You're going to get a judge who excludes your evidence, and you're going to lose, and that's going to be that. You're going to get a judge who, rules against you in certain things, and your star witness can't go on the stand. These things are going to happen, and you're constantly being barraged. There is almost no time for nerves when you are on trial. And think of it as almost going into battle, right? And there's one thing coming from the judge, and then the defendant is lobbing something else. And then there's a bomb that gets thrown and explodes, and you can't see because of the smoke. Like, it's survival. It's really just survival often. So, that is where I came to it, from nerves. And you do have to have a little bit of nerves. You have to have a little bit of adrenaline. If you are doing something so important and you're glib about it, there's something wrong.
Right.
You have to care. You have to have that emotion. And I think some of that in the courtroom, as well as in public speaking, some of the true emotion about mesmerizing public speakers comes from having that investment. And when you have that investment and you're ready to, put everything out there, some of the nerves come with it. And, it just kind of converts to adrenaline as you move on, is how that was my experience. I don't know if with you all it's different. I'm sure lots of people in the audience have different, listening, have different experiences too. But, my best way for combating it was preparation and practice and knowing exactly what I was going to say in those first 30 seconds.
Great advice.
Yeah, before we actually go more into helping people find their unique voice and how you coach people, let's just linger a little bit more in the legal system, because I think there's so much interesting stuff here. Love to get your opinion on it. I would love to get your opinion on what's going on with the uptick in violent crime across America. I mean, just for context, the BBC noted that overall violent crime was up about 3% in 2020. And then Pew Research shared a study that showed data that the US murder rate rose 30% between 2019 and 2020, which was the largest single increase in a year in over a century. So I'm really just curious from your perspective, like, what insight do you have around the uptick in violence? And maybe you can tie that into like what's going on in the prison system right now. And because of the pandemic, how many prisoners are being released. I'd just be curious around like how you think about the current violence that's going on, not only here in the States, but even just generally around the world. I mean, when you have hundreds of thousands of prisoners around the world that are being released because they might be at risk of COVID, or, you know, they could be released because, quote unquote, you know, they're not going to compromise public safety, which I'm pretty uncertain how anyone can actually say that that's true. But I'm just curious about your thoughts on the current state of violence.
Wow, that is a lot. Tell me about the 30% statistic. Is that all over the US or in particular areas? I have not heard it that high.
It's a great question. I do not know the answer to,
Okay.
but I do know that Pew Research shared a study that was done by the
Wow.
CDC. And the CDC indicated that the US murder rate rose 30% between 2019 and 2020. To me, it was a shocking number, which is why I thought I'd bring it up.
Oh, absolutely. And I haven't heard that number. That is a shocking number. I mean, looking at the dates that you're given, you know, 2019 to 2020. I mean, the thing that of course goes through me is COVID.
Right.
COVID.
Yeah.
I would be curious to know how much of that is domestic violence related during COVID, when you often have, you know, violent partners in the same place, you know, without any kind of escape, especially. I would wonder what the violence is there in terms of the murder rate. Another thing is kind of the economics of COVID. People being out of work, losing their jobs, feeling like there may be no hope in some places. And that would tie in, I would think, to kind of domestic violence as well. You know, women having less of an opportunity to kind of escape or to have some control over their situation. And maybe that's something, but then a general just hopelessness that may lead to more violence. Without knowing more, it's hard to, you know, necessarily opine on what the factors would be, but it just sounds to me like a lot of the effects physically and economically from COVID could certainly be in there. It is, you know, I also have to bring in, you know, guns and gun violence.
Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Oh goodness, how much time do you have? That's, you know, I don't know what the statistics are exactly, but they are tremendously high and way too high when it comes to children being killed by guns. So that's not necessarily the murder rate, but accidental shootings in families. The idea that a household with a gun is much more likely to have a killing in their home because of the gun, an unintentional killing. You know, and I wonder how much of, you know, a lot of the laws that are more permissive on guns and the open carry laws are adding to that murder rate. I don't know. I'm certainly going to look it up when I finish this podcast with you, because you all have sparked my curiosity on it. But I do think that, I mean, look at school shootings. Look at the access, you know, in particularly, I believe it was in Michigan recently with the school shooting where the parents were also ultimately charged. Followed that. You know, here's a child, 15 years old, who's obviously troubled, who had no problem getting a gun that his parents actually bought for him, taking them to school and killing people. So the just prevalence of this access, like this unfettered access, I would imagine has been leading to that rise as well. And I think you can tell by the tone of my voice exactly what I think about people having, especially people who have who are mentally unstable, having unfettered access to handguns and the kind of devastation that they can wreak from that.
Yeah. I think we're aligned on all that sentiment. I could definitely have done a better job of doing the research, but I'm just like thinking, broadly speaking, like when you think about those types of statistics, and then you think about the number of people that have been released recently, it's like hard for me to think about how it gets safer out there. And I'm not trying to scare anyone. I'm just looking at the facts and observing and putting one and one together to get two.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to do some more research. You've also piqued my interest in people being released. I think that it is, as you said, an incredibly difficult judgment to make, to say that someone is not a danger. There are some cases where you could probably make that judgment, but they are few and far between. And that's I don't know whether that's adding at all to the murder rate, but it definitely could be making people feel somewhat uneasy if those releases are being done without adequate judgment or supervision. I mean, even people who are coming out of jail after their sentences are on parole or probation, have some sort of supervised check-in, have some conditions to it. If people are kind of being released without any of that, that could really be a cause for concern.
Yeah. Let's mix it up a little bit more and talk about how there's even more cities that are just not even prosecuting crimes anymore. So just add that layer in there as well.
Yeah. I'm in one of them.
What is not prosecuted where you are, Jay?
Well, there's been a tremendous increase in the number of car break-ins and like petty theft, people stealing goods from Walgreens or from local grocery stores, and hardly any of these crimes are prosecuted when the amount of goods stolen is a few $100s, or the amount of damage done to personal property, is just a few $100s. But it just erodes, I think, your sense of community and sense of safety, knowing that your car could get broken into at any time, or you could see someone, walking out of the Walgreens with stolen goods right in front of your own eyes. So, yeah.
It does not add to a sense of safety. It also doesn't create the kind of community and, ultimately the kind of world where people feel that they need to follow the laws because there are going to be consequences. And ultimately that is, what the criminal justice system is all about, about justice, about there being just laws that people need to follow to have an organized society where people can live without that kind of fear, because there are consequences and accountability for not following those laws. And if you let the small stuff go, people just feel emboldened, to start doing bigger stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was in Japantown the other day, and someone went up to a scooter that was tied to one of the poles out front of the restaurant. There were two of them. One person cut it with bolt cutters. The other person, walked it away, and it was actually belonged to one of the waitresses within that restaurant. She came out yelling at them, but they're both wearing masks. They're wearing all black. You don't know what weapons they have, and she kind of just yelled at them, and they continued to walk away down the street with her bike. And I went and talked with the guy who owned the restaurant. He's like, it's we've been seeing this for years. We are looking for accountability, increased security or increased police presence from the city. We're not getting it. And, there's a human cost to this. Like, she doesn't have a way to get home now. So I don't think people, it's like, so it's terrible.
It's ultimately, it's not, this will sound like a child, but it almost is that simple. It's just not fair. Right. I mean, this waitress spent her hard-earned money for transportation to get to work. And it's not fair, and it has an impact. At our home, I'm in Denver. We've been the victim of violence, and I almost don't want to say victim, because none of us are personally harmed and everything's okay. But, 3 times there have been cars outside our house that have thrown stuff at our house, whether it's, eggs or like food items. Or there was actually this thing going around, I don't know if you heard about it, it will sound really strange, cheesing cars. People will take, it is so bizarre, slices of cheese and put them all over cars on the road. And someone did that to our car. I mean, it sounds always funny and ridiculous, but and then they came into our yard and did it around our house. And so okay, nobody's hurt, but our privacy was invaded a
Right.
bit, and yes, there are so many more violent, traumatic kind of crimes. But if people feel emboldened to do that kind of thing, maybe they'll take the car next, maybe they'll come into the house next. And what if they come into the house next and they get surprised and they get violent?
Right.
What if my child comes home and they're home alone and someone comes in the house because nothing happened when they threw eggs and nothing happened when they snuck up and, vandalized a window. So why not take it a little bit further? I mean, that's really scary stuff.
Yeah. And that's exactly, I think, the cost of it. You're left with all these questions when you don't know who it was. And, there's someone out there that's willing to play outside the rules of society. You're left with all that uncertainty, and there's tremendous psychological burden there.
Yeah.
And then adding to that
Absolutely.
uncertainty is the recent news from different cities around the country where, police officers are choosing to either retire or leave the force because I don't want to really get into this side of it, but they're not getting vaccinated. So that's the last time I'll use that word on this podcast. But because of that, just adding to the uncertainty that Jay was alluding to, I mean, it's an interesting time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you had a guest on one of the sessions I listened to about police and about kind of reforming some things and a lot of peacefulness and just
Lisa
kind of
Broderick.
making projects. Yeah, that was really interesting. And, we don't have to, I certainly don't have time to get into the whole topic, but I do hope that, some of those things come to pass so that those issues aren't really there anymore.
Absolutely.
So actually the word fair and just has come up multiple times. I'd be curious from your seat, your perspective, and now as an advisor, how would you update someone on what's going on in the legal system? Like what's been fixed, what's been improved? Because I just feel like it's an old system, but we're trying to be talking about like how it's just and fair. I'd just be curious, like if you can just highlight the types of reforms that are happening in the legal system that people should know about.
Yeah, well, I can, I'll highlight one cause that's been pretty important to me, especially over the past few years since I left New York, something that I was not as involved in, which are just these real access to justice issues. The idea that the legal system does not necessarily serve a tremendous number of people. So I'll give you an example of this here in Colorado, and it's all over the country. If you have a lot of money, or you are an organization or a company or a corporation who has a lot of money, you can easily pay a lawyer however much they're charging you per hour, right? You're covered. If you are really destitute, I think in Colorado, it's under $12,000. That's what you make per year. And you qualify, you can get legal aid. Criminally, you can for your criminal case, but also for civil cases. There's a statistic that says that about 70% of people go into court without a lawyer when they have a civil case. But out of those 70%, nearly the entire 70% could afford some kind of help. But that help is not out there. A lawyer who charges reasonable rates and is transparent and predictable in their pricing, they just don't exist. Right, for some of these people. So there is this whole kind of middle market of legal consumer who maybe is getting a divorce or needs a child custody agreement or wants to do a will, to figure out what happens to their house when they pass away, or they have an immigration issue or something. So all of these issues that come up, and yet they're going to court without attorneys. They're trying to do things themselves. That ultimately slows down the court and how they work. And here are all these lawyers, either in the public interest sector, working for legal aid, making very little money, or people working at these giant law firms where the rate of suicide and the rate of alcoholism among attorneys is the highest of almost any profession. So, how do you kind of provide access to justice to people, make a change in the legal system that way, while also encouraging attorneys to be able to live lives where they can actually be well, where they can make a sustainable living, where they have some control over their life. And when it doesn't get to the point where, suicide and all sorts of other addictions are the answer to kind of these lives that these attorneys are living in this pressure-filled environment. So the legal system is changing. I was part of the first what's called a legal incubator in Colorado,
Nice.
which helped attorneys start their own firms focused on these issues and serving these kind of clients and just having this entirely new business model. So, it sounds like an oxymoron to some people, but we're changing that. Legal entrepreneurs. Okay? So attorneys who start firms who want to help these people, and they're not charging $800 an hour. They're not telling people, I don't know what it's going to cost. I don't know what I'm going to charge you. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm just going to keep sending you bills. They're not doing that.
Yeah.
What they are doing is really revolutionizing the legal field. They are starting subscription services. So just like you might pay for your Netflix, how about paying, a minimal amount per month to have an attorney on call? And that if you need that attorney, you have some legal advice right there for you.
That's great.
Yeah, they do things like fixed fees. Someone comes in, you said, okay, it's going to cost you, X number of dollars for me to handle your divorce. These are the 5 things I'm going to do for you. And if it turns out you need more, we're going to have a new contract and you'll pick the next 5 things you need me to do. But for these 5, this is what it is. Doesn't matter if it takes me 5 hours or 100 hours, you will get those things done for this price. It's amazing. It is amazing. And, there are incubators that crop up all over the country, but this one in Colorado is now, we were a nonprofit, but it has now been taken over by the Colorado Supreme Court. They are funding it and managing it. And, what that really says to the people of Colorado is, we are working to change the legal system so that it can serve you, so that it can work better, so that you have the help that you need. And so, kind of like what you were saying, Jay, that all of these things in your community so that you can feel that you are taken care of, that there are people out there who actually believe that even those smaller little things get attention and get some accountability. And so the lawyers are out there. I mean, they're putting their prices right up on their websites. Divorce, $2,500 or whatever it is. I mean, it is pretty incredible and it's revolutionary because the legal field in terms of business is probably about 10 to 15 years behind, the regular business field.
Wow.
And lawyers are taught to think a certain way in law school. And it can be a very narrow way of thinking. But there are some people out there, many of whom I got to work with on this project who are changing the entire field of the legal system. And so that's one way that it's really changing in this term of access to justice. And what an amazing just feeling for people to think it's not going to bankrupt me because I want to do a will. It's not going to bankrupt me because my husband and I are getting divorced. I can have money for my kids' college instead of spending $40,000 on a divorce.
Yeah.
I can actually pick up this phone call.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's been a pretty incredible experience to see these lawyers who are leaving law firms or leaving other situations where they may be working and taking their experience to really become entrepreneurs, which is so huge, I think, everywhere these days. And especially here in Colorado, the ecosystem is really there to support them. And they're doing so much good. And our tagline for Legal Entrepreneurs for Justice is doing well by doing good.
Nice.
So you don't have to starve to be able to do good in the world. You get to have a thriving life too. And of course, being Colorado, they are so creative. We have one guy and also one woman who basically have a van, and that is like their legal van office. And they travel all over seeing clients, and they're living out of the van. And they've got van life, and they're serving clients, and they're making money, and they're helping people. And it's pretty cool, and it's pretty different.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. And just doing well by doing good. I mean, I think that's exactly what people are demanding now. I mean, they want transparency, they want accountability, and they want to be treated like a human.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so many things, we've democratized access to so many things, be it information or entertainment or financial services with robo-advisors and kind of do-it-yourself trading platforms. And I think it definitely is time to democratize access to legal aid, because I feel like for most of human history, a very small sliver of the population has had access to high-quality legal aid.
Yeah. It really has that ripple effect into, almost every part of life. And yeah, why not? It doesn't need to be this kind of elite thing that you can only get into if you have a ton of money. And it shouldn't be.
Mhm.
We all have to follow the laws. We should all have access to a lawyer when we need it.
Yeah.
100%.
What do they say? Have access to a lawyer, a mechanic, a dry cleaner, pretty much
A plumber,
an accountant,
a
Yeah.
doctor. I mean,
A
look at
doctor,
telehealth, has really kind of democratized things. I think that's a bit of the wave of the future too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being able to be on video with the doctor, that has given, in a way that we're trying to give access to justice to people by also having things on the phone or having things on video to people who are in rural areas that have zero lawyers around. I mean, zero. Like we call them, legal deserts here in Colorado. They have nothing. That democratizes it the same way that, people get access to medicine that they might not have been able to get before because they can go online, after the kids are in bed, or they can, do stuff, when it fits with their schedule and get medical attention. So just another of those services that's important.
Absolutely. This is a conversation that, we basically focus more on the legal side of things. I know you're obviously a coach. I just wanted to kind of go down that direction for a minute or two, just because obviously you're a confident communicator, you're clear, you're articulate, you have experience in the courtroom. I'd just be curious what your thought is on why you believe more people should prioritize learning how to communicate better, and how you would suggest that they fit it into their busy lives.
Good question. See, I'm using the power of a pause right there.
Yeah,
I
right.
think about what I want to say and yet somehow sound intelligent because I'm just taking a deep breath. So, look, it is sometimes difficult to, no matter how good a communicator you are, convince people that this is something they need to pay attention to. Because people are just,
Right.
like you said, going along their busy lives. And if it's not broken, let's not fix it. We're all good.
Yeah.
Communicating is something that we do in every single facet of our lives. It's not just on a podcast. It's not just in court. It's not just, in public speaking. If you are speaking to a client, you need to have clear communication. If you're pitching because you want to get an investor to help your company, you need to be clear and compelling. If you're going on a job interview, all of these things, even if, you're trying to convince your teenager why they should, not do something or should do something, you're communicating. So what is a more important skill to have to get your ideas out in the world and to really, honestly live a life where you are heard and you are understood than communication? And people don't pay a whole lot of attention to it, but once they do, and once they start seeing the changes that come across, then they do. Then they really start to dive in. And I kind of almost liken it to, in some ways, to a child who's learning how to speak. Children can get so frustrated. They can't necessarily say the words, they can't necessarily communicate the words, but once they do, this whole world opens up to them. And the frustration is gone because they have the power of getting what is in their head out of their mouth and out to the world. And that's what people need to have. You do not have to be an epic speaker to communicate well. You don't have to tell the best story in the world. You just need to be yourself, and you need to think about what value do you want to communicate? Because it's ultimately not about touting yourself and all of your accomplishments. It's about, what are you giving? What are you giving? What are you sharing? And when you start to think about it that way, it becomes a bit more attractive to people. It becomes a bit more understandable. Ultimately, if people are going to take time to do something, they want a return on it. So yeah, the return is you're going to get more business. You're going to make more money. You're going to get the job that you want. You're going to advance in your career. Those are kind of the tangible returns, but the real intangible is that amazing feeling of sharing what you know and your value and your ideas with the world and with other people. And ultimately, doing what I like to do as a prosecutor and what drove me to be in the courtroom is just ultimately you're making their lives a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you're freeing yourself in the process.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you say that because I was just recently thinking like, it's January and I was just thinking like, how do I want the rest of my year to go? Or like, what new things do I want to incorporate in how I operate? And one of the things was like, the thing that I want to pursue is finding my function. So just be in pursuit of finding your function in any given situation. So find your function to me means like be on a pursuit of just constantly delivering value, be on the pursuit of constantly giving, be on the pursuit of constantly sharing something that's going to increase, the livelihood of someone else next to you. So it's really interesting that you say that because it kind of just ties into some of these thoughts I've had recently of like, the pursuit is not about money. It's not about job title or anything like that. The pursuit should be finding your function in any given situation. And then ultimately that just boils down to like, what value are you bringing to the table?
And when you do that too, I would imagine that this happens for you as you kind of go through that. The idea of the nerves, the idea of all of that, the idea of how you look and how you sound. And while those are all part of the message, that kind of fades away. When you're really into that message of what is your function and what are you giving, and it's all about who you're giving to, the rest of it just becomes less important, but it actually, it really improves your communication because it's, gosh, I hate this word, but it's authentic. So forgive me the woo-woo words, but it's authentic. And I tell, I tell every single client and everyone I work with, and everyone I talk to, if you want the number one, tip at being a good communicator, you need to start with being yourself. Where you need to start. And so for you, Arjun, thinking about what's your function? What do you want to give? How do you want to give value? You are fully being yourself. You're not, trying to fit into some different kind of mold. You're thinking about what is my function in this situation? How am I giving value? And that's going to make your communication clear. It's going to make it compelling because of where it's coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like kind of top-down approach to becoming a better communicator. You start with like your goals, your values, what you're trying to deliver to yourself and to the world, and the rest follows, as opposed to trying to spot treat specific things like filler words or trying to use specific sentences or clauses. It seems like, so I was going to ask you actually, Laurie, if there was any kind of low-hanging fruit that you think people can work on to become better communicators, but it seems like really the starting point isn't about maybe going after the low-hanging fruit as much as it is finding your reason for speaking in the first place.
Jay, I could not have said that any better. If I can take your recording and just use it, I mean, really, no, you totally nailed it, because it's about your content and it's about your delivery. But honestly, the delivery is the easy part. The content is where you need to start. What are you saying and why are you saying it? Exactly what you said. And, you really kind of diving into all of that, because that's ultimately what's going to make the delivery easier. And it's so perfect. I mean, you nailed it completely. But if you like, I will give you a little low-hanging fruit if you want.
That'd be great. Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll give you my two things that anyone listening to this can do that can make your communication better right away, today, tomorrow, whatever. These are my two things. Start strong and end strong. Okay. How many times have you gone to a presentation where someone would say, hi, I'm Laurie. We're going to talk about public speaking. I have 25 slides, so let me start reading them to you.
Yeah.
Right? You just want to walk out. Start strong. Primacy. People remember the first thing they hear. You have 2 to 7 seconds to create an impression. You need a hook. Arjun had some great hooks with all the statistics and the research and everything. Numbers are so good. They're so interesting. They just grab you. What's your hook? Ask a question. Use a great statistic like Arjun did. Tell a story, Jay, like you did. I mean, you shared about being the victim of a crime that was incredibly compelling. Those are great ways to draw people into you and make them want to learn more. Start strong. Okay. You have this great opportunity. Hook them. End strong. How many presentations have you been to where somebody just kind of peters out at the end? They go, okay, Any questions?
Yeah, right.
Right? Okay. The same concept. Primacy, you remember the first thing. Recency, people remember the last thing. You have the control over how you want to leave your audience. What do you want to leave them with? Is it a call to action? Do you want them to do something? You know, do you want them to subscribe to the podcast or rate the podcast or listen to the podcast? What do you want them to do? And how do you want to leave them? You want to leave them inspired. You want to leave them questioning. You want to leave them thinking, I learned these 3 things. What do you want to leave them with? Okay. So you have this great opportunity at the end of any kind of communication that you have to leave them with something. So don't give that up. You know, same kind of thing. Ask a question, use a great statistic, tell a compelling story. Whatever you're going to do something. Use that time. So start strong, end strong. It can change your communication really easily.
I'll remember that. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll definitely remember that as well. Speaking of ending strong, let's end with this one final question. What's the thing that you love most about yourself?
Wow. So you don't end with the easy ones, do you? What do I love most? Right now, the thing that I love most is I have embraced being a bit of a risk taker.
Nice.
And I never thought I'd be an entrepreneur. Sometimes I call myself the reluctant entrepreneur. I never thought I'd have my own business. I never thought I'd be running a business and teaching and coaching and training. But as I look back, everything has kind of come together to lead me to right here. And I am not generally a risk taker at all. I'm kind of a worrier, and I'm kind of like things to be kind of very, organized, put together, and I like things to be predictable. So I have embraced my risk-taking side or created one. And I'm pretty, I pretty much like that about myself right now. I think it's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
That's really cool.
That's wonderful. That's inspiring. And what I hear from that is just bravery, willing to try something new, and just, you've reached a point where everything's kind of led up to this moment and you're just leaping and letting the net appear. So
yeah, if you had told me a few years ago that I would be sitting here having this really interesting conversation with the two of you, I never would have believed it. So
Same.
You just take those risks. Yeah. You never know what can happen.
Absolutely. Well, we're so glad you did. It's been wonderful sharing space with you, Laurie.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks, Sergeant. It's been great.
It's been a great conversation, and we look forward to another one with you.
Can't wait.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.